Currently, Sony is profiting from its market leader position. More than double the console sales compared to Microsoft, and a staggering portfolio of exclusives make the PS4 into one of gaming's greatest success stories. While there's always room for criticism, by and large Sony definitely did more things right than wrong. Mistakes have been made. The No Man's Sky debacle and increasing the price of its PS Plus servers, to name just a few, but they pale in comparison to the PS4's achievements. However, a couple of recent business decisions on the part of Sony have sparked a discussion among gamers. People fear that Sony, being perfectly aware of its dominance in the console market, is starting to regress to the consumer-hostile and arrogant company it used to be during the early PS3 days. What if Sony doesn't feel the need to be ambitious anymore? PlayStation fans still have nightmares from the horrific PlayStation 3 reveal and Sony's utter incapacity to listen to its fans. Needless to say, we don't want to see the arrogant PlayStation 3 era Sony ever again. But what makes people think this is exactly where Sony is headed? Well, it all boils down to two fairly recent events: Sony's bizarre E3 press conference and the crossplay controversy. The first point should be self-explanatory. The games showcased at Sony's E3 2018 showcase all looked fantastic, but that wasn't the problem. What left many bewildered and angry was the strange and somewhat pretentious presentation. In hindsight, a 15-minute commercial break and out-of-place musical performances weren't the best idea. I do understand why some people interpreted Sony's E3 conference as a sign of arrogance. I wouldn't be too concerned about the fact that the last two E3 press conferences were lacking big exclusive game reveals. Keep in mind that the next console generation is already on the horizon, which means Sony is strategically holding back massive announcements in order to be prepared for the upcoming battle against Microsoft. In terms of E3 showcases, we are currently in a time period I like to call the Valley, meaning the last few E3s tend to be devoid of surprising new announcements, because everyone is getting ready for the next generation. It's the calm before the storm, so to speak. What keeps dominating the news cycle lately is Sony's unwillingness to open up the PS4 for crossplay with other consoles.
But that would be the case, at least, if Sony were cool with cross-platform gaming as well. Which they're not.
Sony, what are you doing? Turns out if you played Fortnite on PS4, you can't bring anything over to Fortnite on Switch, something that isn't a problem on any other platform, including Xbox, and people are mad.
But the big issue that is only getting worse and worse right now is Sony's decision to not allow crossplay.
Because Fortnite is at the center of popularity and an unstoppable money-printing machine played on every platform imaginable, Sony's reluctance in terms of crossplay is facing major backlash. Microsoft tries to present itself as the knight in shining armor, which is more than a little bit hypocritical, since Microsoft was doing the exact same shit last console generation when they were market leader. But Microsoft's hypocrisy about the whole thing doesn't make Sony's stance any more valid. While some people argue that Sony's decision makes perfect sense from a business perspective, given the fact that they are market leader and don't want to share profits with Microsoft and Nintendo, the general consensus online is that Sony's behavior is nonetheless anti-consumer. By not allowing crossplay and carrying over progression from your Epic account, Sony is basically holding your account hostage. There are no two ways about it. That's pretty bad. Bethesda director Todd added insult to injury by saying that they'd love cross-platform play for Fallout 76, but Sony isn't as helpful as they want them to be. The entire crossplay discussion isn't working out in Sony's favor, that's for sure. It makes them appear anti-consumer and stubborn. Nothing lasts forever. Not even PlayStation's exceptional position as the industry-leading force behind the current console market is cast in stone. History tells us after a meteoric rise to power usually follows a swift and sudden decline. The gaming industry is no different. Consoles come and go, and ever since the first major heyday of video game consoles under the helm of Atari, the dominance and success of a company tends to be challenged by aspiring new players, eager to get their share of the market. For a decade, Atari's charming 8-bit pixel games defined the first true console generation. From the early 1970s to the mid-1980s, the Atari 2600 and milestone games like Pong, Space Invaders, Pitfall and Frogger ushered in the era of home consoles, offering an alternative to coin-operated arcade machines. In fact, back in the day, Atari's everlasting relevance seemed so undisputable that the company's name even got immortalized in Ridley Scott's gritty sci-fi classic Blade Runner. In Blade Runner's dystopian future, Atari still remains the undisputed king of the video game world. However, reality doesn't look quite as flattering, I'm afraid. By 1983, the US video game market was collapsing under a landslide of low-quality games, marking the end of Atari's control. Nothing embodies the ungraceful end of Atari's remarkable reign better than the infamous commercial disaster of E.T. the Extraterrestrial. A game so unbelievably bad that Atari had to bury nearly 1 million copies in the New Mexico desert. Atari's downfall gave rise to the golden age of Nintendo. Legendary gaming franchises like Super Mario, Zelda, Metroid and many more cemented Nintendo as the driving force of the console market. Much like Atari, Nintendo's dominance remained unchallenged until Sony entered the game in 1994. Funnily enough, a failed business collaboration between Nintendo and Sony regarding a CD-ROM add-on for Nintendo's SNES led to Nintendo's greatest rival. Sony decided to compete with Nintendo, releasing its own console whose second iteration would become the most successful console in video game history. Thanks to the PlayStation 2, Sony managed to dethrone Nintendo. Blinded by its own success, Sony dismissed the competitive ability of Microsoft's console. After all, the original Xbox couldn't threaten the PS2 despite better hardware. Sony's dismal E3 conference, the outrageous $600 price tag, and overly complicated hardware specifications which turned out to be a huge headache for countless developers, allowed Microsoft to gain dominance and forced Sony to play catch-up with a competitor it didn't take seriously. Which leads us to the beginning of the current console generation, defined by an Xbox division overcome by the same arrogance and carelessness which triggered Sony's decline in power just 7 years before. As we all know, the catastrophic Xbox reveal event
TV experience. TV and movies, TV. Xbox, watch TV. TV.
The disgusting business practices Microsoft was trying to shove down our throats.
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360, that's your message if you don't, like it?
If you have zero access to the internet, that is an offline device.
And a shortage of high-quality exclusive games sealed the console's fate. While Sony was able to catch up to the sales of the 360 eventually, regardless of Phil Spencer's efforts, the tremendous distance between Xbox One and PS4 remains the same. Throughout the entire generation, the PS4 managed to outpace the Xbox One at least 2-1. What both the failure of the PS3 and Xbox One have in common is a company ignoring the demands of its consumers and becoming more and more arrogant. In both cases, arrogance and lack of ambition marked the downfall. This phenomenon is what I like to call the never-ending cycle of arrogance. What this little history lesson is supposed to tell you is the simple fact that the console market isn't known for stagnation. Companies rise, then they fall, allowing someone else to take their place, only to return to old strength a generation later. Now the question is, Have Sony and Microsoft finally learned their lesson, or are Sony's most recent business decisions a first warning sign for the continuation of the cycle? For now, Sony's dominance in the current console market might seem unshakable, but one should never be too certain, since just one fatal mistake can have devastating consequences, as both Sony and Microsoft had to learn the hard way. If Sony keeps falling back to old habits, the tide could turn in Microsoft's favor again. But let's not forget how immense the PS4 is outpacing the Xbox One at the moment. We are talking about a 40 million units lead. Occasional missteps and bad press aren't enough to seriously shake Sony's position. Only a fuck up of tremendous proportions could put Xbox back on top. If Sony keeps investing in a diverse and meaningful portfolio of exclusive games, makes the PS5 backwards compatible and maintains a $400 price point, it becomes almost impossible for the next Xbox to catch up to or outsell the PS5. Sony is in a very comfortable position right now. All they need to do is keep appealing to the hardcore gamer audience and not make a mistake on the magnitude of PS3 or Xbox One scale. As long as Sony keeps its guard up, the PS5 should be on the perfect trajectory to success. As promising as Microsoft's most recent studio acquisitions are, don't forget that Sony's first-party network as well as second-party relationships vastly outpace Microsoft. All Sony has to do is found a new AAA studio, as they are currently doing in San Diego, and maybe acquire one or two talented developers, and the gap between Sony's exclusive portfolio and Microsoft's is restored. Microsoft won't be able to rival PlayStation's enormous studio network anytime soon, especially if Sony is going to expand as well. Phil Spencer can talk about an industry-leading first-party network all he wants, and believe me, I appreciate the effort, but in reality, this is nothing more but pie-in-the-sky PR talk. Sony is still light years ahead thanks to world-class developers like Naughty Dog, Sucker Punch, Guerrilla Games, Santa Monica, Sony Japan and many more. One of the biggest takeaways from this console generation is the discrepancy between Microsoft's fixation on services and Sony's fixation on high-quality games. While the Xbox One is suffering from a severe drought of meaningful and memorable exclusive titles, Sony fails to improve already existing services and add new ones. Microsoft's extensive backwards compatibility program and innovations in the vein of Xbox Game Pass are way ahead of services like PlayStation Now, whereas Sony's impressive catalog of top-tier exclusive games puts the Xbox One to shame. In that regard, both companies have plenty of room for improvement, and it's difficult to argue that Sony is obviously more arrogant than Microsoft. So, is Sony getting arrogant again? Well, a little bit. After all, they're dominating the console market and their exclusive content is rock solid. The real question is Sony as arrogant as it used to be? To which I say, definitely not. We are not dealing with a PlayStation 3 era Sony here. The reason why so many people are jumping to conclusions is because they have been burned in the past. I'm sure most of us remember all too well how Sony used to treat its customers and fans not so long ago. We should definitely be cautious and keep a watchful eye on Sony, but we also shouldn't get carried away. Sony's stance on crossplay is unfortunate and worth of criticism. At the same time, the Sony of today should not be equated with the ignorant and smug Sony we had to put up with at the beginning of the last console generation. PlayStation 3 era Sony hasn't returned as of yet. We don't have to wait a whole lot longer for a definite answer. As the life cycle of PS4 and Xbox One is coming to an end, the next console generation is just around the corner. Many of the games showcased at this year's E3 could turn out to be next-gen titles, rather than something the base models of PS4 and Xbox One can handle. Especially Microsoft is eager to make a fresh start, which is why Phil Spencer already finally confirmed the existence of a new Xbox family, codenamed Scarlet. The next Xbox and PS5 are probably targeting a holiday 2019 or 2020 release window. In a best case scenario, both Sony and Microsoft show a willingness to learn from past mistakes and finally break the never-ending cycle of arrogance and unnecessary PR disasters. Hopefully, Sony won't be overcome by old habits and Microsoft turns into a serious competitor once again. Competition sparks innovation, which is why all of us should be interested in a healthy and ambitious competition between Sony and Microsoft. After all, it was Sony's PR machinery that kept capitalizing on Microsoft's anti-consumer marketing. Sony appealed to the hardcore gamer audience, which felt left behind and ignored. Don't forget who brought you here, Sony. Don't forget. I, for one, can't wait for the next console generation. This should be one hell of a fight.